Hello everyone and welcome. I'm Naveen Agarwal and I'm so excited to welcome all of you to this live discussion today. This is a part of our weekly live discussion series where we talk about common day-to-day questions and challenges you face as you implement risk management for your medical device. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you wherever you are. Make sure that you share in the chat below where you are joining from. Tell us a little bit about your role in the risk management process or the quality management system for your medical device. Introduce yourself just a little bit. Okay, so these live discussion series are more about a conversation about day-to-day challenges and problems and questions. They are not meant to be a webinar. We are not going to have a big presentation or a big lecture. We will start with our focus topic or question with only a couple of slides and then open it up. Along the way, feel free to share any comment or question or best practices in the chat below. In fact, the more you share, the better our discussion would be. But keep in mind that this is an open forum. So do not share anything that is proprietary or business sensitive. Be professional at all times, especially if you disagree with the comments or discussion. See, we are not here to argue or debate. We are here to have a discussion, have a conversation, and learn from each other. No one person, including me, has all the answers, and it is through this collective discussion that we learn from each other. Keep in mind that nothing we discuss today should be taken as regulatory advice, either for regulatory compliance purposes or regulatory submission purposes. This is only for the purpose of information exchange, asking questions, sharing viewpoints. Differences in viewpoints are always welcome, and learning from each other. That's what this is all about. So today, we will be together for about 30 minutes or so, and I'll kick off our discussion with just a brief slide presentation to introduce the topic today, which is going to be around risk estimation. Now, risk estimation we know is a requirement of ISO 14971. And in practice, I have seen a lot of confusion and as a result, some mistakes about risk estimation. If we don't estimate the risks accurately, we won't be able to evaluate the risks accurately, correct? And let me share with you that there's an increased sensitivity and awareness on part of the regulatory authorities on this topic. I have personally seen very recently a couple of warning letters from the FDA already to big manufacturers where they are questioning the accuracy of risk estimation. So this is a very, very important topic. So keep your comments and questions coming in along the way. I'll be monitoring that on my screen in the chat and address those questions and comments along the way as soon as I possibly can, or certainly after the slide presentation is over. But you don't have to hold back. Just share anytime what is top of mind for you. It could be about risk estimation or any other topic. We are open. Okay, so let me share with you only a few slides. So risk estimation is a requirement. For each identified hazardous situation, the manufacturer shall estimate the associated risks using available information or data. Shall means it's mandatory. And remember, they are saying for each identified hazardous situation. So it's important for us to clearly show what is the hazardous situation, what are the applicable hazards, what is the harm, and what is the risk of that harm. That's what ISO requires, right? We talked about hazard analysis in one of our recent live discussions. Where we get confused about this is when we try to estimate the risk of harm for ISO 14971 inside an FMEA. That's where there's a lot of problem and confusion. And we can talk more about that during our discussion today. Feel free to share questions and comments as they come to your mind. So what is a risk? Let's first understand that risk can mean different things to different people in different contexts. In the context of ISO 14971 2019, risk is a combination of the probability of occurrence of harm and severity of that harm. It's a combination of these two factors. But what does that mean? How do we combine them? Do we add them together? Do we multiply? Do we do quantitative? Do we do qualitative? ISO is not clear about that. So we have to be basically understanding for ourselves what this combination means and how we're going to combine probability of occurrence of harm with the severity of harm to accurately estimate the risk. So industry practice is a risk chart or a table. You have severity on one axis and probability on the other axis, right? And you could have multiple risks, R1, R2, R3, R4, R5 at different locations, right? Think of an XY coordinate frame. X-axis is severity, Y-axis is probability, and based on the two numbers, you can plot a point. Now, in many cases, people assign a qualifier to the risk level, low, medium, or high. But what does that mean? What is low? What is medium? What is high? Sometimes these are not very well defined or arbitrarily defined. Low in certain scenario may not be low in other scenarios. And we tend to define them in qualitative terms. So I want to share with you very, very briefly a best practice, which I believe is a good way to move forward. Not the only way, but it's a good way. So of course, you can have severity scale 1 to 5. I have seen that in practice. You can define those 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 levels, quantitative terms, qualitative terms, and some description as clear as possible. And you can have probability levels 1 to 5. Now again, they could be qualitatively defined, or you can have a quantitative probability range or a frequency range. So you potentially can have different combinations of severity and probability. And what I think we should consider, and I would love to hear from you how you practice in your risk management process, what works for you, what doesn't work for you. We need to have equal importance to probability and severity. There should be equal weight when we combine the two. ISO doesn't say that treat probability any different than treat severity. They are independent of each other and they should be given equal importance. So let's play out a scenario. We have a 1 to 5 scale for severity, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and we have a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 scale for probability. So when severity is 1, you can have 5 scores for probability, and when probability is 1, you can have 5 scores. You're just multiplying the two numbers. When it's 2, you can have 4, 6, 8, and 10 based on different severity levels. Similarly, when its probability level is 3, 6, 9, 12, and 15. 8, 12, 16, 20, 10, 15, 20, 25. So you can have all these combinations, right? But when you multiply the two numbers, you have a numerical number. Now, it may not mean anything from a mathematical point of view, from a probability point of view, but it is a reflection of a certain level. And we are not assigning a value judgment to that number. We are not saying this is low, this is medium, this is high. It is just a number. So you are defining or estimating a risk by a number. Now notice that I have color coded these numbers. These combinations are unique combinations. So a 2 here or a 2 here should be treated the same. A 4 here should be treated the same. A 15 here, a here should be treated the same. We should not say that because we arrived at 15, since our severity was 5, this 15 somehow is more important than this 15. When you give equal importance to probability and severity, you are not assigning low, medium, high, or a value judgment to these probability numbers. This is, I believe, a good practice, but I would love to hear from you how you estimate risk. Now, we have talked about only the risk estimation, how you get to probability scale or a probability level or a severity level. We have not talked about that. That's really another topic. But again, depending upon your questions and comments, please keep them coming. We will discuss more, and I will discuss with you where we might have some problems with this. So with that, I invite you to share your questions and comments. I'm keeping an eye on my screen as these comments come through. Make sure that you are sharing whatever top of mind for you, because this discussion is all about your questions and comments and challenges that you face in risk estimation. So keep them coming. So while you are thinking about that, let me go back to the comment I made in my presentation that many times we get into difficulties because we are combining risk estimation in an FMEA. So in an FMEA, let's be clear about this. We are analyzing the failure modes. We are analyzing different failure modes, the way the devices can fail or malfunction, their causes, and their effects. Now, device failure may not lead to harm, or harm may happen even when the device is operating normally. We know that, right? So when we try to now estimate or show risk estimation in an FMEA, question would be, which probability are we thinking about? Is it the probability of the failure mode that we are just looking at, or is it the probability of the related harm that we are thinking about? ISO doesn't require the probability of a failure mode, but it does require the probability of the harm based on the hazardous situation. So this is definitely, it can be a little bit challenging. And I wonder if this is something you have seen in your practice and how you have resolved this. How are you looking at the probability level assignment in an FMEA, or do you do something different? How do you get to a probability level assignment in your risk estimation? Severity, we know, we work with medical professionals, we assign a severity, and in many cases I've seen a master harms table already developed. But it's the probability, I think, that is where we get a little bit confused. And that's where I think risk estimation, in my opinion, becomes a little bit confusing and inaccurate. So would love to hear from you, how you manage this situation, and what does the risk level as estimated in your process, what does that mean? So share below in the comment and chat below how you manage this situation, or any other question you have in mind. So another area to think about is post-market. As post-market information is coming back to you through complaints, adverse events, as that information is coming back to you, how do you assess that the risk level has changed? Right? You have to figure out a way if the severity has changed or the probability of occurrence has changed. And I think that's where you have to be very clear about how you estimate that number, how you estimate that level, and does it align one-to-one or close enough to what you have shown in your risk files. So if you have shown the risk levels in an FMEA, we just talked about where there might be a confusion. Sometimes this alignment may not be good enough for you to see if what you have shown in your risk management files or risk assessments or FMEAs is equivalent or comparable to what you might be estimating through your post-market information. So that's another area of challenge. And of course, I would love to hear from you how you manage that situation, and if there are any particular methods that you use or any approach you take. Because we should be estimating the probability and severity using the same scale, the same level, the same way that we do during design and development in our risk files and post-market. The method should be the same. The approach should be the same. The data sources potentially should be the same, similar. And then figure out a way if they make sense. And only then can we easily see if the risk levels are changing or not changing. Remember, ISO is talking about hazardous situation. We have to pay attention to what the hazardous situation is to be able to estimate the risk levels accurately. So let me see if there are any comments here. Please keep them coming. Share whatever is on top of mind for you on this particular topic, or any other topic if you have in mind for today. I would much rather address that and make sure that you are able to get the answers that you are looking for, and the challenges you are facing, you are able to make some progress towards those challenges. That's the whole purpose of these live discussions. So I'm really excited to hear from you. Make sure that you just openly share that. So I have not seen anything come yet. So let me tell you a little bit more about where I was going with the conversation related to FMEAs and post-market and why we find this issue so challenging. As I mentioned before, in a failure mode effects analysis tool, you're looking at failure modes, causes, and combinations. So the right thing to do in an FMEA is to look at the occurrence rate of the failure mode. That is not the same as the occurrence rate of a hazardous situation or a harm. Big difference. And this is probably the most common place where I've seen a confusion in industry practice, and as a result, a lot of challenge in analyzing post-market information. So now you may ask, how do we move forward? If we do failure mode occurrence in a FMEA, where do we do the occurrence rate for the harm? Right? That's a topic we can talk more about in future discussions if that's of value to you. But we have to do it differently. Let's agree on that. FMEA is a good tool for failure modes analysis and reliability improvement, but it is not a good tool for hazard analysis. We have talked about that in our previous session. So you do a hazard analysis separately, and there you estimate the probability of occurrence of the hazardous situation and harm. That's where you do it, not in an FMEA. And if you do it right, if you set the method right, you will be able to compare the post-market information one-to-one with what you have in your hazard analysis. Where we find difficulty, in my experience, and again I would love to hear from you, where we find difficulty is we estimate a rate of occurrence or a frequency based on post-market data, and we cannot find a way to compare it in what we have in our risk file. So as a result, we cannot make a determination if the risk has changed. How do we tell? And for that, we have to dig deeper and we have to set things right and make sure our methods are appropriate, both for failure analysis and for hazard harm analysis. That's what we need to do. So this combination, what I recommend and what I've seen as a best practice is a mathematical combination, a multiplication of two numbers, probability being 1 to 5, severity being 1 to 5. However we come to those numbers is a separate conversation. But once you have done that, that number is there for you and you can compare how it has changed before and after. So this is where it is important to kind of do it right and do it in a proper way and not mix FMEAs with hazard analysis. So let me know what's in your mind, if it is making sense to you, what challenges, questions you are facing around risk estimation in your process. Make sure that you share that in the comments below. Okay, so if there are no other comments or questions, let me just quickly recap our discussion today. We are talking about risk estimation. And estimation of risk is a requirement for ISO, but ISO talks about ISO 14971 talks about risk estimation in the context of risk of harm, in the context of a hazardous situation, not in the context of a failure mode. So that's point number one to understand. So when you mix the risk estimation with FMEA, you may have to do a few more things to do it correctly. Okay? A common way of having this combination of severity and probability to get to risk level is by using a 5-point scale, 1 to 5 scale for probability of occurrence, 1 to 5 scale for severity level, and then combine the two. And based on that combination I showed in my slides, you can have a unique number for the combination. It will range from 1 to 25. That becomes the risk level. We are not assigning low, medium, high value judgment. It's just a number. And if you set that right, you can compare the number that you will arrive at by looking at post-market information. Okay, so looks like we have a question here. How far severity scale could be? Okay, so from that I understand what would be a range of the severity scale. If that's not correct, please share that in the comment below as well. Clarify that. Generally speaking, 3 to 5 levels for severity are sufficient. Anything below 3 may not give you enough granularity in different types of harms. Anything more than 5 may be an overkill and you may struggle. Is it a 6 or a 7? Is it a 4 or a 3? So in my experience, a scale of 1 to 5 is what I have seen to be most effective. Severity is although it's a numerical number 1 to 5, but it is not quantifiable. It is not quantifiable in the context of harm. Now, in the context of other risks, like let's say financial risk, you could probably assign a level of financial loss. You could assign a level to a certain level of damage. But in the context of risk of harm, it is most often a qualitative assignment. And that qualitative assignment can be confusing. So it is very important to assign a level and a definition, a description of that level based on medical judgment. And typically I have seen people use things like it's negligible, or it is temporary, reversible, or it is permanent, or it is serious, it is critical, it is life-threatening, or death. Now, the risk of using qualitative terms is that they may mean different things to different people. So whatever terminology you use corresponding to those 5 levels, you should explain it very, very carefully and give examples in the context of your medical device of known and potential harms. In the context of those medical device related harms, give example of what might be considered level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4, level 5. I hope that answers the question, but let me know if there's any other thought in your mind or any other question on this topic. So let me make the same remark about probability scale. Now there you can have a quantitative level, right? Then you can define a range of frequency, a range of occurrence in a quantitative way. And that's where I also recommend people to use 1 to 5 scale, but make that scale logarithmic. Make level 1 significantly lower than level 5. Do not use a linear scale. It's best to use a logarithmic scale. We can talk more about that. Okay, so there is another question here. Is it required by regulations to link pFMEA severity levels of manufacturing process of medical device to patient harm? Now, regulations, or let's say ISO 14971, is not specific about pFMEA or dFMEA. It doesn't even talk about a FMEA. It doesn't even talk about failure analysis. It just says you must analyze the risk of harm. However harm can happen. It can happen through device failure, and device failure could occur because of design issues or process issues or use issues or supply chain issues. Now, in a pFMEA or a dFMEA, I would recommend that you focus on the occurrence rate of the failure mode. Do not confuse that with the occurrence rate of harm. How you connect the two is a different challenge, and we can talk more about that in our other conversation. So there is no specific requirement to link that for patient harm. None. It's up to you how you will analyze it. Okay, so we have another question here. I have a question regarding pFMEA. In pFMEA template, is failure effect is harm P1 and failure causes hazardous situation? Very common question and very common point of confusion, and I'm sorry to say it is not true. A failure mode is not a hazard or a hazardous situation. We cannot be doing P1 and P2 in an FMEA, and if we are doing P1 and P2 hazardous situation harm in an FMEA, we have to do a little bit more work to make sure it is right. The problem is that if you consider a failure mode as a hazard or a hazardous situation, you're making an assumption that single failure mode is always going to lead to a harm. We don't know that for sure. It may lead to that harm, many other harms, or the same harm could happen even without that failure mode. So that is why ISO 14971 does not make any connection between failure risk analysis and risk of harm analysis. They leave it to you. Now, having said that, FMEAs are very, very important. I don't want to undermine them. But you have to do it right from the purpose of engineering and risk analysis, and do it right for the purpose of risk of harm analysis. These are really two different types of analyses that we do, and I've seen them combined all the time. There's a lot of problem with that. Then you have a follow-up question on that. How we assign P1, P2 value in pFMEA? You don't, and you don't have to. There is no requirement anywhere that says you must have a P1, P2 in FMEA. Even for the risk of harm, ISO 14971 does not require the P1, P2 approach. It just tells you P1, P2 approach is one way of doing it. You could calculate the probability of occurrence of harm in other ways as well. It doesn't have to be P1, P2. So if we are doing it under the perception that it's a mandated requirement, that is not true. Now, if we choose to do it, it is fine. If we have data and information, it is fine. It is a good way of estimating the probability of occurrence of harm. But in a pFMEA, if we are using P1, P2, or in a dFMEA, if we are using P1, P2, we have to do a little bit more work to do it right. You don't have to do it. So I would ask you to go and review why you are doing it and how you are doing it, and see if that makes sense. And the way you will evaluate if it makes sense is by asking the question, are we looking at the effect of the failure mode purely on the product or the process, or are we extrapolating? Are we going the extra step in our mind, jumping from that failure mode to harm? Hazard analysis is the work where you have to do through sequence of events and harms. And one failure mode could relate to multiple sequence of events and harms and hazardous situations. So I hope that answers your question. If you are doing P1, P2 in pFMEA, I also don't want you to think it's not right or you're doing it wrong. You can do it. It is not required, but make sure you are doing it right. And the way you will test that, whether you're doing it right, is by looking at your post-market data. The rate of occurrence of a certain harm based on post-market, does it align? Does it make sense in the context of what you have done in your pFMEA? Can you find P1, P2 from your post-market data? You may be able to, but in most cases, you do not have that information. You do not know the rate of occurrence of a hazardous situation and the probability of hazardous situation leading to harm. In most cases. In some cases, you may have that data. So it depends. It is not right or wrong. Where I focus in my practice is helping people understand if it makes sense for them, if it makes their life easier or it makes their life more difficult. If it's making your life more difficult, P1, P2, getting that numbers accurately for your pFMEA, be aware that it is not required. It's not mandated. So I hope that answers the question and gives you a little bit of comfort in knowing that it is not required or mandated by ISO 14971. Now, having said that, some of the auditors or notified body auditors or inspectors may expect you to show them an analysis of risk in an FMEA, right? And you should do analysis of risk. But the right analysis of risk in an FMEA is analysis of failure risk, not the risk of harm. That's where it becomes very difficult. Very common problem in the industry. I've seen it in many, many cases. And I think people are struggling with this. So I would love to hear from you. What are your challenges? So with that, let me recap again. Risk estimation is a requirement. How you do it is up to you. They have left it vague. And I think as a result, there's a lot of confusion. ISO 14971 just requires the risk to be estimated as a combination of probability of occurrence and severity of harm. That's it. Now, how we do it is up to us. And the confusion comes because we mix the failure risk with the risk of harm in an FMEA. In general, there are many other people who are doing it really well. I've seen a lot of best practices in the industry. And it is my intention through these live discussions to help you understand where the challenges are and how you could improve your process. So reach out to me anytime through LinkedIn or through these live discussions. We'll be live every week, and we are still kind of thinking about the schedule, but it'll be during the week around this time to accommodate all different time zones. So I look forward to hearing from you and connecting with you. And nothing will really make me more happy than just having these conversations with you on an ongoing basis, because my purpose and my intention is to help everybody get better in the practice of risk management. So with that, I want to thank you for your time again today. Those who have not been able to join will find a recording, and even those who have joined, you can view the recording again. And I look forward to connecting with you again.